Welcome. You are tuned to Cafe Cabaret. We are now offering a new phase Cafe Cabaret. For the next 10 weeks, we'll be offering a seminar on comedy hosted by The Wrong Hero. Volume 1 of our seminar is entitled Mirth. This seminar was 2 years in the making, and we hope you enjoy it as much as we took an effort to render it enjoyable. This is, of course, produced by Francis DiMenno. Hi, I'm the Wrong Hero. Alex Sears has said, "Why is comedy such a serious business? Perhaps because what we laugh at tells us who we are, if often in unexpected ways. It is an index of national identity. As William Hazlitt once said, British comedy is, quote, mirth, a temporary relaxation from civilized, quote, gravity, as welcome as a, quote, streak of light which illumines our, quote, national gloom." Hi, I'm the Wrong Hero, and this typically awkward introduction is, in fact, an attempt to rationalize the title of this presentation, which is called Mirth. As a matter of fact, for the next 10 weeks, yes, for the next 10 weeks, I, that is to say, the Wrong Hero, will basically be sharing with you everything I know about the subject of comedy. However, it should be said that my presentation will not be confined in its entirety merely to comedy, because in the grand scheme of things, and particularly in the grand scheme of creative endeavors, comedy is as inseparable from any creative form of expression as, say, dirty jokes are from any other jokes. It is merely our willingness, ability, proclivity to put everything into segments and slots that causes us to separate the art of comedy from the art of creative expression in general. Now, this is not intended to be part of the text, mind you. It's just my way of explaining why I'm going to discuss varied forms of creative expression under the pretense of giving a 10-week course in comedy. Now, the problem with my presentation is that it really hasn't been set into any readily definable order. That is to say, you are going to be treated over the next 2 hours to a lengthy series of what will basically amount to non sequiturs. But, of course, utilizing my great experience in creative endeavors in general and in comedy in particular, I will attempt to make the synaptic leaps as painless as possible. Now, one of my notes, in fact, one of my very first notes in this field states, comedy, clarity, catharsis. And that basically is a nutshell definition of what constitutes comedy. Basically, comedy limbs things, to use a word which is only found in a translation of Goethe's Faust in the English language and virtually nowhere else. Comedy outlines things in a clear and rational way, and yet at the same time, it puts a peculiar spin on those clear and rational things that creates the sort of unexpectedness which results in laughter. And that laughter, in its turn, creates what the Greeks called catharsis. Now, I'm not too up on my classical studies, but my understanding of catharsis is basically an experience which is revelatory in a way that alters your perceptions, whether it be for the duration of a 3-minute song or for the rest of one's life. I can't say that there are an awful lot of things which, having read, have changed my life. However, those few things which I do recall did in fact have a profound effect on my way of thinking. When beggars mount, they ride the horse to death, as Shakespeare stated, and that is certainly food for thought. When beggars mount, they ride the horse to death. Now, it has been said by John Osborne, who I believe is the British playwright, recently deceased, nothing, not even race or language, divides the world into faction more than comedy. What penetrates the human spirit with more enlightenment and wisdom than humor, he asks. And that in turn leads us back to the definition of humor as comedy, clarity, and catharsis. Because after all, a laugh illumines the soul. I am badly mangling a quotation by somebody whose name I don't recall. Matthew Arnold has called art the sheer desire to see things as they are. And that, in turn, leads us right back to a definition of comedy. Now, don't think for 1 minute that the remainder of this 2 hours is going to be spent merely defining comedy. However, in this first week of this presentation, we will be spending a great deal of time doing just that. However, I do not intend for it to be the sole topic of the presentation for this week, which I should remind you is entitled simply, excuse me, you weren't expecting that, were you? Mirth. And if I could stop clearing my throat, that would be a welcome relief too, I'm sure. Now, Stanley Kaufman talks about a twist in a plot. A twist is a plot development that surprises us and throws a backward light on what has happened up to that point. A good example, as a matter of fact, of that very phenomena is this movie, which I just rented, called The Usual Suspects. Does it list the name of the director here, I wonder? Let's see. A film by Bryan Singer. Well, I don't want to give away the shock, surprise ending, so let's pick an example which perhaps more people are familiar with and which is less contemporaneous. That of Citizen Kane, the classic twist, because of course the words which are said at the beginning of the Rosebud turn out to be, of course, Charles Foster Kane's beloved sled. And it gives you room for thought because the last moment he was happy, he was holding a sled called Rosebud, and everything from there was basically downhill. Well, comedy depends upon a twist in large part. Again, it's the old topic of the unexpected, and perhaps I was inspired to get into comedy from an episode of the Dick Van Dyke Show in which Rob Petrie's son is ashamed of him because of his profession as comedy writer and doesn't want him to speak at show and tell at the first or second grade suburban school which the Petrie progeny attends. But Rob wows the elementary school children by utilizing his knowledge, his intimate knowledge, that comedy is basically the unexpected. And you know, when I say a plot twist, I don't necessarily simply mean that classic O. Henry type short story, you know, where, she sold her long hair to buy him a watch fob, and he sold his watch to buy her combs for her long hair. You know, somehow I think a watch fob is more valuable than stupid combs, right? But hey, that's just me. I'm a guy, and I don't make any apologies for this. I wish I could say that, I find this O. Henry stuff really fascinating and heartwarming and touching and stuff, but basically that story, The Gift of the Magi, is an example of a plot twist which is so familiar that it has almost become hackneyed. However, getting back to this film, the whole film is filled with plot twists to a certain degree, but of course the big twist at the end is what makes the whole movie fall into shape. And if you can imagine that, not having seen the movie, then you can imagine how a plot twist works, and in fact, how a one-liner operates. Like, what was that Rodney Dangerfield thing? Oh, when I was a kid, my father gave me a bat, but it flew away. You know, that sort of thing. It's the commonplace, humdrum, followed by the totally unexpected. Or, to use an example, one of my own wry jests and merry quips, I like to spend hours in the tub. Sometimes I even put water in there. Now, I'm going to pause to allow you to digest that and for the gales of riotous laughter to resound throughout television land. Now, Elizabeth Bishop, the poetess, although I think she might possibly reject that term as a description of herself, having in fact known her and studied under her, and having once in fact played a cruel jest on her. One time I showed her something which I purported to be a poem written by her, and she said, "That doesn't make much sense." And I replied, "Well, actually, it's something you said last week that I copied down verbatim," which was, of course, a mean thing to say and do, but she didn't mind. She kind of liked me. I don't know. I guess I was mischievous and in that charmingly frank way that only adolescents can be. Well, anyway, in her notebook, Elizabeth Bishop wrote that the qualities most admired in a poem were accuracy, spontaneity, and mystery. Now, I think maybe that can be applied to what we call humor as well. Accuracy, you have to have a sense of the culture that you're dealing with in order to relate to the audience. Spontaneity, it's very important. You have to rehearse endlessly in order to create that air of casual spontaneity which causes people to respond. So I suggest, if you're ever planning to do this comedy thing yourself, memorizing a bunch of stuff that you can just throw in seemingly at random, which will seem spontaneous, but which of course will be carefully rehearsed. And I'll give you another example of that. I was being heckled at a recent show at AS220, and although this was part of my script, I said, "Lord, give me patience," which everybody assumed was a response to the heckler, and they laughed at that. I said, "Lord, give me patience now." And this seemed so incredibly spontaneous that I got perhaps one of the very best laughs of my entire career. People like it, you see, when the comedian comes up with something seemingly spontaneous that reasserts his hegemony over the audience, or her hegemony. Let's not be sexist here. Anyhow, as Elizabeth Bishop states, the qualities most admired in a poem are accuracy, spontaneity, and mystery. Now mystery, the quality of mystery as applied to humor, it's somewhat intangible, and I say that only because I haven't really carefully thought through what I'm going to say next. But mystery, every joke creates an air of mystery insofar as the audience wonders how the person telling it ever came up with it. Now, I'm not talking about your standard joke that you can copy out of a joke book or out of one of Rodney Dangerfield's monologues. I mean, I'm talking about comedic material as performed on stage. Basically, a stand-up routine. Now, unless you purport it to be a part of your actual experience and create a convincing case for it to be just that, people will in fact wonder how you ever came up with the idea. How did it come floating into your head? In subsequent weeks, particularly in week 3, which will be March 6th, I'm going to discuss some techniques of how to come up with humorous material, using, of course, the quotes of other great humorists, liberally leavened with my own commentary to do so. But the air of mystery that a comedian creates is created in part not only because people wonder how he came up with the material, but because there is something mysterious in general about speaking to an audience. How does he do it? How does he come up with the material? How does he memorize it to the degree that it seems spontaneous? And most of all, how can he bear to get up and expose himself so nakedly to an audience or, a group, especially if it's a group that is not familiar with him and which isn't on a first-name basis with him. You see, the mid-level comedian has it very difficult. A first-timer or somebody who's relatively inexperienced will get a lot of leeway from an audience. They will be more inclined to let him or her tickle their funny bone because they know that he's inexperienced, and it's an encouraging process. The well-known comedian is practically a brand name. You know what the comedian is going to have to offer in the way of entertainment because he's a known quality. You've perhaps seen his performances in films or in comedy shows on television or whatnot, or in sitcoms. And so there's a certain known quality, but it's the mid-level comedian that has to work hardest to create a name for his or herself. And there's where the air of mystery comes in, really. You know a first-timer is going to rely largely on anecdotal material pertaining to their own experiences, and you know that the brand-name comedian, so-called, will talk about things which are in the general run of his material, but it's that guy or gal in the middle who you just don't know about. Well, Jimmy Durante was said to have said, although I think it was actually one of the Misners, Wilson or his brother, be nice to them on their way up because you're sure going to meet them on the way down. And that's the advice I would give to anybody seeing some comedian who isn't necessarily very famous just yet. I've been doing comedy on and off for over 10 years and consistently on a weekly basis for over 8 years. And why am I doing this, you ask? How come I'm not famous yet? It's very difficult to claw your way up to the top unless, you eat it, breathe it, and live it. And I confess that, I have other interests too. Comedy isn't the only thing I do. And so, anyway, I'm not apologizing for myself per se. What I'm saying basically is, because I've been doing this for 8 years, I know that it takes, at least 2 years for somebody to do a stand-up monologue and to really have the confidence on stage to express themselves. 2 years of doing it every week, week after week, without fail, and hopefully 2 years of coming up with new material as well. Of course, these are all things that I will be discussing in subsequent weeks. How to avoid repeating yourself. Now, Robert Angell posits questions that a writer should ask himself. Is it clear? Does it say what I want it to say? Is it too long? Is it just possibly too short? Does it sound right? Does it carry the tone I want the listener to pick up? Is it good enough? Is it any good at all? Now, you know very quickly in a stand-up monologue that whether the material is good enough or whether it's any good at all simply by whether or not people laugh. Whereas with creative writing endeavors on the page, it's much more difficult to know that. A playwright perhaps is closer to a comedian than virtually any other practitioner because a playwright does have the opportunity to see how his or her material is working on the audience. So those questions can be answered, is it good enough, is it any good at all, simply by the audience response. And the audience response will depend on, in large part, on whether in fact what you have to say is clear. I tell a joke about, I like to give my dog a present. I like to put a bouillon cube in the toilet bowl. However, that's not really as clear as it could be because some people think that I'm talking about gold bullion. And of course, it's my Western Pennsylvania accent. I don't know how to say bullion. But, well, if I could think of an alternate phrase, I like to give my dog a treat. I like to put a little gravy master in the toilet bowl. See, now that's a little more clear. Although you can't assume that everybody is going to know what gravy master is either. And that's one of the difficult tasks facing a comedian is whether or not the audience has shared experiences with you to the degree that they will be able to pick up every reference you make, unless of course you confine yourself to the most blatantly ordinary topics. And by no means are these topics all that ordinary, because, for example, not everybody is going to know what sports are all about, or to really care. Like, I think golf jokes probably turn off a vast proportion of the audience. I saw Jerry Lewis on the David Letterman show, and Dave gave an opportunity to tell his killer joke. So what does it turn out to be? A golf joke. And you could just virtually see the smirking Dave just waiting for Jerry to bomb with this stupid golf joke, which in fact wasn't that bad. But it was one of those golfing in heaven jokes, which is even more deadly as far as I'm concerned. Now, you can't really necessarily talk too much about religion without alienating a certain proportion of your audience, although I find that the people who go to comedy clubs don't tend to be the type who are going to be bright and early for church the next morning. To a certain degree, and I'm making this up entirely out of my head spontaneously, I think comedy serves as a sort of secular church for a certain segment of the population. And in fact, comedians, they're a bit like, not priests necessarily, but lectors in a church. Somebody who reads from the gospel, but of course it's not the gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. It's the gospel according to them. There's a title, The Gospel According to Me. Hey, that's not bad. I ought to write that down somewhere. Oh God, I don't have a pen. The one thing I really need is a pen. Well, I'm going to have to try to remember this, okay? Anyway, does it say what I wanted to say? That's very important. Some comedians just go for the laugh, but others actually want to try to say something. They're the ones who I think have lasting value in the marketplace. The comedians who have something to say. And so it's very important for a stand-up comedian to express himself in a way that says what he has to say. So is it clear? Does it say what I had to say? Is it too long? That's always a criteria for a joke. Is it too long? And that's, of course, something I violate constantly. Getting a sense of material, in large part, means knowing just how long you can go with it, how far you can take it before you begin to lose the effect. Someone else says that, the longer a joke is, the bigger the punchline has to be at the end, the bigger the payoff. It's sort of like waiting for dessert in a way. The longer you have to wait for your dessert, the better dessert it had better be. Or is the joke just possibly too short? Well, there is such a thing as a joke that's too short, and it's a joke that leaves out the crucial aspects of the setup, which would create a sense of clarity in the audience that would be clear enough to the audience to enable them to understand what you're getting at in order for the punchline to, in fact, work. Now, this is the most important thing, perhaps, of the entire series of criteria that I put forth for humorous material. Does it sound right? Does it carry the tone I want the listener to pick up? You can sound very, very bitter up there on stage about something which is perhaps a little too close to you, and that in its turn, unless it's so out of proportion that it creates a sense of humorous incongruity, that bitterness in turn can turn off vast portions of the audience. In December, it was December of 1994, I did two monologues at AS220 in Providence. One of them went over really well. The other one was basically about my attempts to find meaningful employment in a 9-to-5 job. And I'm afraid it cut a little too close to the bone for many people who were faced with a similar dilemma, and it sounded too bitter because it was too close to me. And so I bombed, one great set, one down the crapper type of set. And that's something you have to remember when you use anecdotal material. Unless it's really way out of proportion or really understated, the tone may be not necessarily false, but it may ring as too intense for an audience to digest as humor. In other words, they might take you literally, which of course can be pretty deadly. If you say, for example, that, I think drugs should be outlawed. I stopped using drugs. I stopped using drugs 3 hours ago. Isn't that convenient? Now, some people might take this literally, which of course they're not intended to, and actually think that, the comedian just stopped using drugs 3 hours ago. And you don't want that necessarily, unless you want to have the reputation as that kind of comic. But that is an example of a joke which has the right tone. What the audience assumes will be some sanctimonious little thing about how drugs are bad turns out to be a joke in which the comedian laughs at himself, pokes fun at himself, and by implication pokes fun at all of the people with the puritanical mindset about drugs, which of course many patrons of comedy clubs will react. They'll react positively to this. One thing that the stand-up monologue should be is the enemy of sanctimony. Now, it's drifting across my mind the other example of this. Well, getting back to that topic of drugs, I do a bit which goes something like, I'm the wrong hero. Alcoholic, drug addict, easy guy to shop for around Christmas time. Now, I told this little bit back in, probably 1990 at what was then Charlie's Tap, but which is now the Green Street Grill, at the Stone Soup Poets weekly show. And it got an enormously large laugh because they assumed I was going to get up there and do one of these personal poem type things where I talk about the dangers of alcohol and drugs, but then it turns out, no. As a matter of fact, I'm boldly admitting, that I'm an alcoholic and a drug addict, but not in a way that creates a sense of guilt, obligation, or discomfort in the audience, because it turns around back on me. Now, this sort of self-deprecating humor is especially of people like, and I hate to keep bringing this up, but Rodney Dangerfield, and to a certain degree, Woody Allen. This sort of neurotic type of humor which was really in vogue in the 50s and which still resounds today. Of course, the ultimate comedian who bared his soul was, of course, my hero, Lenny Bruce. Well, anyway, this gets us to types of comedy, as long as we're in the introductory mode. Stand-up comedy, improvisational comedy, and sketch comedy. And in week 4, we will be discussing stand-up comedy, and I believe we'll be discussing improv as well. Let me look at my prospectus here. Let's see. Yeah, probably in week 4 is when we'll be talking about improv. In sketch humor, well, I can't say I have an awful lot about sketch humor prepared, but that will be week 8. And by then, perhaps, I will have something ready for you there. Anyway, I'm going to quote an authority now, a fellow named John Cecil, to underline what I've been saying all along, that an essential of comedy is the element of surprise. Now, comedy can be traced all the way back to the Greeks. Literature basically began as epic poetry in oral form, continually changing, depending a great deal upon the speaker. So, as a matter of fact, in epic poetry, there were elements of comedy because, as I stated repeatedly, comedy cannot be separated from the broader field of literature. So epic poetry for the Greeks eventually developed into Greek drama, and this was refined by the Romans into fable, Aesop's fables. So you can see where we're whittling it down. First we have these enormous epic poems which take hours to recite and which continually change. Then you have Greek drama. Drama by its very nature is a form which is in constant flux. You never really finish writing a play. The play that you see on the written page may in fact be the long version of something which will be shortened considerably once it's performed. Virtually no Shakespeare play, to my knowledge, has ever been performed in its entirety. Particularly King Lear and Hamlet, they are generally shortened for the stage because, well, modern audiences don't have the patience, and it is the director's prerogative to improve a play by chopping out bits and pieces to make it flow a little better. So you can see that we're getting this just gradual shortening here from epic poetry to drama to fable. And that's a big thing there, that big leap from drama to fable. It's like, in other words, it's from a long, resounding 2-hour, 3-hour long presentation to a simple, short thunderclap. And of course, Chekhov, the Russian short story writer, was very big into writing in a sort of fabulistic way. And you also have people like, they're called the magical realists, like Italo Calvino and Borges, and folks like that, who also specialized in the fable form. And then you have oration, which is basically what you're seeing right now. Oration. And oration, of course, is basically a didactic mode. All of these modes, in fact, are basically didactic modes. They seek to teach you something. And in my mind, at least, comedy is, in fact, a didactic mode as well, but not necessarily in the negative sense as being, ponderous and soporific. If anything, if comedy teaches you anything, it is about the humor of the unexpected. The laugh is a response to comedy, and the laugh teaches you something if only that's what you laugh at. But comedy should also have broader lessons for the person who is listening to it as well. So we're winnowing down comedy and tracing it to its roots in epic poetry, Greek drama, fable, and finally oration. To a certain degree, comedy is a combination of drama, fable, and oration. Because comedy is basically a monologue, or it could be a dialogue, or even rarely a Dreiegesprach, as the Germans call it, a three-way series, although very few comedians essay to do that type of material. Comedy is basically a combination of drama, fable, and oration. The simplest one-liner is, in its purest form, fabulistic, in that it teaches you something about the world in the process of merely attempting to make you laugh. And of course, oratory has a good deal to do with the art of comedy. In fact, oratory is all but dead, except as performed by comedians on the stage. Oh, people might watch politicians making speeches on C-SPAN. Anyway, in week 7 of this presentation, I hope to get into oratory and its techniques a bit more. Of course, we are now on week 1 of this comprehensive course. This was intended, in fact, to serve as a course, and it was called Humor and Comedy in the American Tradition. And I might as well read you the prospectus, because it might, in fact, enlighten you. Then again, it might not. And again, you might have turned the TV off by now, in which case I'm talking to a room full of emptiness. Humor is an effective tool in many situations, from breaking the ice in social settings to conveying an ostensibly serious message. Some entertainers utilize a familiar persona to underscore their humor. Others rely upon wordplay, paradox, and familiar concepts combined with unfamiliar points of view. Now, wordplay, paradox, familiar concepts combined with unfamiliar points of view. This is integral in comedy. Even a casual examination of the work of successful humorists reveals a common thread which unites their efforts, the element of confounded expectations. The purpose of this course is twofold: to examine a wide range of humorous writings and monologues, and in so doing to enable the student to develop a humorous persona of his or her own. Although the focus of the course will be on humor in the American tradition, there will be some discussion of European models, mostly British, to supply a contrasting viewpoint. Now I'd like to get back to wordplay, paradox, and familiar concepts combined with unfamiliar points of view. I think that pretty much encapsulates a good deal of what comedy really is. Now, unfortunately, I think wordplay has gotten a bad name. Either people associate it with the impenetrable writings of James Joyce in his late period, Finnegan's Wake, or they think of it as like a form of British humor, which is basically impenetrable to Americans, or they think of it as a comic strip like Shoe or something like that, in which, you know, a stupid pun is meant to carry the weight of a hilarious punchline. But wordplay, when properly done, can be very humorous. On the other hand, some audiences are so jaded by it that they will groan regardless of how humorous and clever the way in which you present your wordplay happens to be. For example, and I hate to keep using examples of my own work, but it's the only work that's not under copyright at this time. I do this thing, Jesus Christ, soup. It's a real Hebrew, you see, and of course there's that sacrilegious element, which certain people will find humorous. But there's also the element of wordplay, which certain people will find trite. It has been said, I think it's frequently cited as something that Samuel Johnson said. It has been said that puns are the lowest form of humor. However, that's not strictly true, as we'll be discussing in week 2 or possibly week 3. The lowest form of humor, below even puns, are eccentric spellings of words meant to convey humorous dialect. Josh Billings, but he's actually quite good. I'm thinking Mark Twain does it too to a certain degree, but you see, it's even lower than puns. Take my word for it. Puns presuppose a certain degree of expertise in vocabulary, whereas the Mr. Dooley monologues of Peter Finley Dunn rely on a large part for their humor on the peculiar dialectical spelling of, dialect spelling of the Irish narrator, Mr. Dooley. Henry James, not exactly a person you necessarily associate with boffo laughs. Henry James once said, "Try to be a person on whom nothing is lost." And this, of course, is a very valuable insight. If you want to be a writer of comedy, you have to try to be a person on whom nothing is lost. For example, there's something that's being advertised now called Arudis. Now, does it occur to you that Arudis is a very funny name? Sort of like something that Scooby-Doo would say to Shaggy on the Scooby-Doo show. Arudis! You know, this is just an example of what it means to be a person on whom nothing is lost. Unfortunately, you can rack your brains and try to milk material for humor where no humor exists, but this is very rarely the case. Virtually everything is funny, like the rumbling of this dog's stomach here. That can be pretty humorous. The thing is, it's not the dog's supper time yet. No animals were harmed in the filming of this presentation. The dog's supper time. Hi, Mona. The dog's supper time is not until 6 o'clock, and it's now only about 2:30. And it occurs to me, I'm nearly 45 minutes into this. I'm only on page 2, and I got 20 pages to get through. I'm digressing a bit. Now, something that was said by Borges about translations is very applicable to the art of comedy. Translations exist neither in the original language or in the translators, but in a third language born of the two. And that's what comedy is, too, to a certain degree. A third language born of the original language and the comedic translation of it into the form of a stand-up monologue. In other words, for example, the old Irish Spring commercial, combined with the deodorant commercial, strong enough for a man, but women like it too. And that's one of my bits, the penis, made for a man, but women like it too. So basically, comedy can be a translation which exists neither in the original language or in that of the translator, but in a third language, born of the two. And that's where the laugh comes in, you see. You take something commonplace, filter it to a certain perspective, and the perspective is not the entirety of it, nor is the original concept. It is the melding of the two which creates a humorous effect. Of course, you know, all this talk about comedy is sort of inimical to real comedy. As many people have pointed out, it's almost a cliche to say that you can't really talk about humor without becoming deadly dull in the process. But I hope that I'm not being too deadly dull. You know, I hope people are like tape recording, videotaping this, and watching it later so they can like watch it in discrete little bits instead of trying to sit here through the entire thing, because I don't know if that's going to work, basically. Personality and eros were, for the poet-playwright Shakespeare, primarily aesthetic values. See, and this is Harold Bloom saying this, basically, Shakespeare took elements of character and plot and combined them to create a certain aesthetic value. And that's, to a certain extent, what comedy does too. It takes the comedian's personality and it takes the perspective through which he sees things happening. In other words, the perspective which states, this is how things work, and filters it. It's filtered through that, and it creates humor. In other words, this is who I am. This is how this is who I am. This is the way things are. This is how I see things. This is how I see things as they are. Now, there is a basic dialectic in Greek drama between those who feel that ethos or character is the only proper concern of art. This is something that Plato has stated. And those who think that mythos, action, plot, and myth, is the soul of tragedy. So again, it's this character-plot dialectic here. This is who I am versus this is what happens. And like most true dialectics, it creates a synthesis which is more than the sum of its parts. Now, I'm not going to come down on one side or the other, although I do tend to feel that character dictates plot rather than the other way around. Now, Robert Brustein has said that the distinction between personality and character is a major theme of modern drama. And this is food for thought. He then goes on to cite Pirandello as being obsessed with the basic character of a man versus the mask that he or she wears, which represents what society expects of him or her. Now, the principal way in which a comedian like W.C. Fields delighted people was that he was who he was. He never really pretended to be anybody else except to further himself. He wasn't a hypocrite, in other words. Samuel Johnson, that fountainhead of apropos quotations, once said that no man is a hypocrite in his vices. At least I think Samuel Johnson said that. It might actually be something that Lord Chesterfield said in one of his letters to his sons, or his son. But basically, when you're up there on stage, it's basically your personality, but what makes you get up there? It's your character. It's your wanting to say something. Look, it's me. I have something to say. I'm really going to have to get a pen. I've already forgotten that thing that I was going to write down that I thought was so important, so let me pause here for a moment. Hello, I'm back. The dog's stomach is still growling. Anyhow, I was talking about the distinction between personality and character being a major theme of modern drama, to quote the dramatic critic Robert Brustein. And he is in fact very correct, but apropos to comedy, the distinction between personality and character can be crucial only because character is what makes you decide to stick to it week after week, month after month, year after year, in the face of all of the opposition which you inevitably face. Now, Raymond Chandler has said, honesty is an art. Now, you might go far as a comedian not being honest about yourself and what you're attempting to do, but whether you'll ever create anything of lasting value is, in fact, not really a moot point at all, as far as I'm concerned. You simply won't. Now, if that dog's stomach would stop growling for a minute. Why do Russians take literature seriously? Fools, I suppose, says Norman Stone in an ironic aside. Well, why do people take literature seriously? Are they really fools? Is not literature a sort of counter world to the real world? One in which one can become every bit as lost as one could in the ways of commerce, or for that matter, isn't literature just another world like, say, sports or religious worship? Does man not exist simply because of the hope which alternate ways of thought and alternate worlds in which to dwell offers? You know, for something which people consider to be so trivial, storytelling seems to exert a profound influence on virtually everything we do and say. Well, for example, some folks watch television 5 or 6 hours a day. What is television but storytelling? Some people pride themselves on keeping up with modern current events by reading newspapers and magazines, but what do these media have to offer except stories? People like to go to movies. What are movies but stories? And of course, then there are the people who like to read, and they get their fantasy straight from the source. And comedy is basically inseparable from literary endeavor. You know, this is something that I wish I was able to express to people who wonder why it was that after a promising start as a writer, I decided to go into comedy. They are one and the same. When you're writing comedy, it doesn't mean you're not writing serious work. It means that the work you write happens to be in a genre which is inimical to seriousness. But comedy and seriousness don't exist separately. They complement one another. They are inextricably intertwined. And one sets the other off. You can't have gray without black and white. And so it is with comedy and seriousness. Well, look at Hamlet, for example. Is not the tragedy of Hamlet underscored by the comic elements in it? I refer, of course, to Alas, Poor Yorick, I Knew Him Well, but also that horrible play within a play which the young, precocious Hamlet writes in order to trap the king is, in its effect, basically very comic. Shakespeare has this thing about him where he likes to deal with characters who are pretending to be mad, but who actually are not, but with characters who are pretending not to be mad, but actually are, or characters who are driven mad and yet have glints of sanity. King Lear, Macbeth, Hamlet, Othello, all of his major plays, all of his major tragedies in any event, have this element. Now, I can't pretend that I read all 38 or 39 of Shakespeare's plays, and that is, of course, something I hope to do by the time my life is through. But I have read the major ones. Some people think, this is one of those things that people think but never say, that Shakespeare's clowns are not really very funny. It's unfortunate that they think this way, and they don't actually say it because it's true. Anyway, a wound possibly is expressed through a quest for order, which literature is, says Arthur Miller. A wound, some event which took place in your distant or recent past which has wounded you, sparks you, inspires you to create something out of it, milking triumph from adversity, so to speak. comedy is, I think, basically a way of dealing with wounds. People wounded you, and with comedy you will wound the world back. Now, this is something, this is like basically the story of W.C. Fields' life. He had to live as a vagabond. He left home at the age of 11. The rest of his life was basically spent in figuring out ways to get back at the world. Not that he was personally a mean man, but that was his comic persona in Rodney Dangerfield. I don't get no respect. What could be more wounding than that? I don't get no respect. It's not for nothing that is in fact his litany, because that is in fact his character. And that's the thing about comedy. You have to find a voice in which to express yourself. You can't get up there and just do jokes about Star Trek. I mean, there's more to it than that. Now, in many respects, comics are orphans. And Anthony Lane has defined the notion of an orphan as being the peak of freedom and the nadir of loss. Like literature in general, comedy is about loss, a wound. You're trying to get back something because of something you once had but lost. And once again, we're getting back to Citizen Kane and Rosebud. He had that sled. It was his happiest day of his life, and he was never happy again. And he was thinking about that damn sled for the rest of his life. Well, Arthur Miller talks about his character Willie Lowman in Death of a Salesman, and he states, Willie Lowman does have values. The fact that they can't be realized is what's driving him mad. And again, this is another aspect of the me versus the world temperament which a good comedian will have. It's like, the difference between what you want to accomplish and what it is actually feasible for you to accomplish drives a great many people and provides their motivation not only to be humorous, but to do anything in a creative way. Well, and of course, people often say, oh, he's such a genius he can't even get a job. And this was expressed by Joyce Carol Oates as, like many writers, Raymond Chandler seems to have been unsuited for any other career. Look at me, for example. I'm supposed to be following up on jobs right now, but I'm not doing that. No, I'm doing this. For now. I'll do the jobs later. It's on my mind, you see. It would be ideal if I could have like a really good paying job days and then devote myself to my endeavors nights instead of having this fairly good paying part-time job and no peace of mind during the rest of the week in which to successfully pursue this comedic thing. Anyway, Norman Mailer, who often says things that don't make much sense, but who in this instance perhaps is making sense, says, "It is the essence of middle-class intuition that art is reckless. Art is putatively criminal." Of course, you might be reading more of his own character into art than perhaps is wise, but there is something about art which creates in a bourgeois mind the notion that it's just a waste of time, but it's not. Art is not a waste of time. Unless, of course, it's bad art, in which it's not only a waste of your time, but that of everyone else. Of course, in response to that statement by Mailer, a fellow named Richard Shattuck says, "Mailer remains deaf to the powerful case that can be made for the artist as someone who can probe the subtle and elusive condition of the normal because of his own superior normality." Oh, by the way, I met Norman Mailer, but that's neither here nor there. Yes, I mean, there's this thing, the artist as outsider, and yet the artist has to be an insider in order to create works that other people can relate to. So again, it's this dichotomy. One cannot exist without the other. You can be a complacent Irma Bombeck type humorist who writes about washing machines overflowing and septic tanks backing up, which of course can be pretty nauseating, although to her credit, she does come up with some good zingers every now and again. And she has been at it for so long that I suppose a little bit of coasting can be allowed. I mean, I sure as hell wouldn't want to have to write that sort of stuff every week. I mean, it would be, well, I'd do it if someone would give me a job, but it's not easy. It's not as easy as it looks. Inspiration, that's why writers place such stress on discipline, because inspiration comes in fits and starts, and you have to condition yourself to sit down every day and work on your material or your writing in order to tap that inspiration when in fact it does come. Mencken said that you don't really need to be a full-time writer, because most writers at the end of 3 or 4 hours have basically run through everything they're going to have to say for the day. The human mind can only express about 3 or 4 hours worth of good stuff a day, and then bam, that's it. You might as well just take the rest of the day off, because you're not going to write anything worth a darn. And I think that is so true. Such a prescient man H.L. Mencken was. Life must be lived forward, says Kierkegaard, but it can only be understood backwards. You can't constantly dwell on the past. But if you want to understand where you've gotten to, you have to, at the very least, be cognizant of things which have happened in the past. The things you've done right. That's the best thing I ever did. Or the things you've done wrong. If I had my life to live over again, that's the one thing I would change. Now, there is a fellow named Jay Bottom who says that all great novels take place at the same location, at the intersection of culture and narrative, at the dark and bloody crossroads where battles over culture's understanding get fought out, or gets fought out. At the intersection of culture and narrative. That sounds like a street in Los Angeles. Actually, it sounds more like a street in Boston. But culture and narrative. Again, you know, this is like basically personality versus character. It's mythos versus ethos. It's that great dichotomy which potentializes, the one potentializes the other. Plot and character, culture and narrative. Who you are and what you do. Thomas Mann has said that his books are full of fun and music, and that he is essentially a humorist. Well, I don't know if you've read any Thomas Mann lately, but Death in Venice doesn't exactly sound to me like the title of a hit Broadway musical comedy. But he has a point. And again, you know, I'm dragging out a big name here, Thomas Mann, to show you that comedy is basically inseparable from creative endeavor. Now, English humor depends upon wordplay to a large degree. And Julian Franklin has said, the pun is the power unit that drives and has driven English humor. At this stage, I believe I'm going to be getting into some of the history of comedy in this, the second hour of this 2-hour presentation. Now, Don Rickles. Let's look at Don Rickles. I think a name which perhaps we're all familiar with. Don Rickles basically made his reputation as an insult humorist, a subset of humor, as opposed to, say, Louis Anderson, who is an anecdotalist, along with Garrison Keillor, folks like that. Somebody who lives comfortably in themselves and has devised a way to express themselves in such a way that makes the audience feel warm and fuzzy and comfortable. Don Rickles and folks like him thrive on antagonism. Don Rickles' career was made when Lenny Bruce was kicked out of an engagement in Vegas, and he was called in at the last minute, and his star rose as Bruce's, in fact, was falling. This is so often the case. Rush Limbaugh took the place of Morton Downey Jr. Now, I could go on and on about this, but I'm sort of losing the point. But insult humor is actually very old. It didn't begin with Don Rickles by a long shot. There was the ancient Greek insult contests. There was something that the British would practice called flighting, which is basically, you know, ancient British insult contests. It is also known as water wit in Gershon Legman's book, The Rationale of the Dirty Joke. Basically, these people were floating down the Thames River on barges, and the bargemen would shout insults to the people on shore, and the people on shore would shout insults back to them. And in the ghetto milieu, in the inner city milieu, this was known as the dozens. You know, like, you mama's so fat she had her own zip code, things like that. Oh, your mama's so fat, she block out the sun. She is the sun. You know, that type of thing. And so one aspect of humor, tracing it all the way back from the Greeks, which, again, to remind you, we have epic verse, and then we have drama, and then we have the fable. Well, another aspect of ancient Greek literature is the insult contest. And again, it's this thing where two discrete and separate things come together to create a synthesis. A thesis and antithesis results in a synthesis. I am me, and you are no good. Well, I am also myself, and you, in turn, are in fact the one who is no good. Well, those two come together and create a synthesis, which, of course, results in humor. An insult contest which was entirely one-sided would probably not tend to be as funny as one in which the other participant gives as good as they get, simply because the audience's sympathies would be entirely upon the victim of this tongue lashing, and somehow sympathy is not a good milieu in which to be a practitioner of humor. Billington places the appearance of the fool in the 13th century and traces its presence through Chaucer, Shakespeare, the appearance of Jack Pudding, Harlequin, and the modern-day clown, and all the way up to the Hollywood silent screen comedians. The character of a fool is another integral part, long-lasting, long-enduring of humor. Every comedian basically has as their occupation fool. George Carlin came out with a record in the 70s called Occupation Fool, and he talks quite knowledgeably about this very topic, and you are recommended to look that book up. In fact, I hope by the end of this, or at least during a week when I'm sort of short on material, to discuss at greater length a bibliography for those of you who are interested in pursuing this subject further. Now, this is where we get to American humor, but before we do, to discuss the figure of the fool. The fool, as you know, takes many forms. The fool, the harlequin, and the clown, and the Hollywood silent screen comedian, right up to the present day stand-up comedian. And then now the Jester, Vaudeville in Yiddish, first appears in the Middle Ages, according to Stephen Confer. The Jester first appears in the Middle Ages, amusing the guests and annoying the leaders with his impudent diversions. The merrymaker was feared on account of the rhymes which he freely used for his own purposes, getting back to Greek drama and narrative poetry. The merrymaker was feared on account of the rhymes which he freely used for his own purposes and frequently caused embarrassment. People were amused by his apt parables, again, the Roman fable. People were amused by his apt parables, paraphrases, and merry songs, and then proceeded to censure him. And again, we're not looking at a new phenomenon when we're looking at the modern-day stand-up comedian. We are looking at the figure of the fool, the clown, or we're looking at the figure of the jester, who sort of corresponds to a certain degree to the fool in King Lear, the person who, because of his lowly stature in the king's court, and yet the great value which his entertainment is given, is permitted pretty much to say whatever he likes. Jane Field has said, "Nothing is funnier than the truth." Now, that is the truth. Whether there's nothing funnier than that statement, it remains to be seen. But nothing is funnier than the truth. And yet, so much of comedy does not, in fact, deal with the truth. The truth can make people very uncomfortable. In fact, let's see. People don't like to hear the truth. The truth makes people very angry. So I say, people who tell the truth are not very popular. So let's kill them. All three of them. Anyway, yes, another attempt to stick my own brand of humor into this presentation, but hey, you know, if Bob Hope's gag writer can do it, it's a fellow named Parrott, who I will be citing, by the way. He's a very good source of this type of humor theory. If he can do it, so can I. Anyway, in the 19th century, the American nation started moving away from its European, mainly British roots, and building a new society that brought with it geographic expansion, swelling demand for greater democracy, a market revolution that converted the country from an agrarian to an industrial society, a frenzy of activity to reform existing social conditions and institutions, an outpouring of literary masterpieces, and an explosion of religious zeal known as the Second Great Awakening. And I'm quoting Robert V. Remini here. So in just that way that America moved away from British culture, so too did American humor move away from British humor. And as I mentioned before, British were really into puns. Americans were more into what is called orthographic humor, eccentrically spelled words. Because of course, you know, Noah Webster was the first to standardize American spelling, which is still by no means 100%, is still not 100% standardized, by the way. Anyway, to quote myself, to write humor, you should have a mind like a sponge, but an eye that can adjust itself to a narrow focus. In other words, you have to have a broad sensibility, and yet you have to be able to, almost on command, canalize, narrow that sensibility down to one precise beam or ray of light. Focus on just that one aspect of something that makes it humorous. For example, the Saturn car. You know, it's a pretty broad topic, but Saturn was the god in Greek mythology who devoured his own children, which of course, as we all know, makes it a great name for a car. Now, it says here, the genre of postmodernism is epitomized by parody, but humor is not the ordinary but the unexpected, with elements of irony and satire. American poetry and fiction have initially been derivative of English models, but American humor is distinct to the U.S., from the tales of frontier justice, where the know-it-all outsider gets his comeuppance, to the present day. Now, there are two distinct models of British versus Yankee humor. Well, actually, there are two distinct models of humor according to Cohen, whose book Southwestern Humor is one of the books in my bibliography. Mark Twain and Herman Melville. And Mark Twain is a good example of frontier justice where the know-it-all outsider gets his comeuppance, because that's the entire plot of Pudd'nhead Wilson. But of course the tables are turned. Pudd'nhead Wilson turns that around and becomes a man of great reputation. Of course, some have said that Pudd'nhead Wilson is just Tom Sawyer under a different name. And Booth Tarkington took this same formula and reversed it in The Magnificent Ambersons. The know-it-all Georgie Minifer gets his comeuppance at the hands of the city folk. Initially, he resists the innovation of the motor car, but is proven to be wrong, and in fact has to make his living driving a dynamite truck, which is one of the more unlikely jobs held by literary characters that I've ever read of. But it's ironic, isn't it? Georgie Minifer hated cars, and yet he got a job driving a dynamite truck, and he got into an accident, no less. Well, anyway, we can trace American humor. We could go all the way back. The Puritans, of course, had a sense of humor, although it's not much appreciated. Stage presentations were a big thing in American life, post-colonial American life. But let's start at the 1880s with two media that most folks gathered in for an evening's entertainment. In the 1880s, the upper classes went to playhouses, and the lower classes went to saloons. Now in the 1890s came vaudeville and the minstrel stage. Now, of course, vaudeville depended on musicians, jugglers, magicians, singers, mind readers, opera singers, baseball players, storytellers, dancing bears, strongmen, puppeteers, acrobats, comedy teams. It was basically a send-up of the legitimate theater so beloved by the upper classes. And yet, it was a genre that was aimed at the middle class. It was, quote, something for everybody. But, of course, its evil cousin, the minstrel stage, heavily depended upon ethnic stereotyping. Now, in the 1900s came Nickelodeons, and in 1915, The Birth of a Nation basically gave movies, the silent film, its 15-year run. Whoops, that's the phone. I gotta interrupt this presentation momentarily. Hello, I'm back. The dog's stomach is still rumbling. I hope this phone isn't too ringing all afternoon. Anyway, you can trace the history of American entertainment for the past 100 years or so. 1880s, you had playhouses and saloons. 1890s, vaudeville, up till about the 1930s. 1915, the silent cinema. 1920s, live radio broadcasts from ballrooms. You also had speakeasies. The 1930s, you had dance marathons. In the motion sound films. The 1940s, people went for their entertainment to nightclubs, and that's in fact where the nightclub comedian had its genesis, basically. All those folks that were no longer in vaudeville and who couldn't get jobs on radio or in motion pictures became nightclub comedians. In fact, there were still some vestiges of nightclub and striptease. In fact, Jay Leno got his start in the Combat Zone in Boston, emceeing striptease shows. So then in the 1950s came television, and that changed everything. As you're probably well aware, television it eats up material. You can no longer do your same 8 minutes over and over, or your standard vaudeville turn of 20 minutes as a featured headliner. I believe the standard vaudeville turn for a featured solo stand-up comedic storyteller was 18 minutes, which is about the outer limit of people's attention span. And in fact, the half-hour sitcom is roughly 23 minutes long, and it doesn't depend, of course, on a single person doing a monologue. But anyway, in the 1940s came nightclubs, and all those nightclub comedians who were put out of work by television often found work on television because of its propensity to eat up material. In the 1960s, people went to coffee houses for their entertainment, and that's where a comedian like Lenny Bruce got his start, as opposed to the Milton Berle axis. You had the Lenny Bruce and the Mort Saul people, they were doing their, Bob Newhart, they were doing their stuff in coffee houses to a more cerebral audience. In the 1970s, gong shows, in which it was sort of like a throwback to vaudeville, except all of the acts were like first and second string, like they stacked vaudeville acts, like the best people went on last, but the dumb show was first. That was something that didn't depend upon spoken words, so that people who came late wouldn't interrupt the act or not be able to follow it. And then, in order of progression came the various novelty acts. The gong show sort of took all the good stuff out and just made it into one big novelty act, but that didn't last long, mercifully enough. And then in the 1980s came the rise of comedy clubs. In 1980, there were probably no more than maybe 50 or 60 comedy clubs in the entire country. But by 1990, there were probably 500 or 600, and that at a time when the comedy boom had already come and gone. Now, I got into comedy in 1985, where it was basically peaking, and I got out of it in 86 because it took so much of my time. But I kept my hand in. For about a year and a half, I would do a show once every 3 or 4 months. I did a show in Louisville, Kentucky. I did one in San Francisco. And in 1988, I got a regular gig in Cambridge, which I milked for all it was worth for 7 years. Well, in the 1980s came comedy clubs. Now in the 1990s, some say sketch comedy is going to be the new thing. Well, that remains to be seen. Now, just as the venues in which people sought their entertainment changed over the course of 100 years, so too did the notion of celebrity. Up until about 1910, celebrity was basically society figures, people who were society by virtue of blood. You know, the Vanderbilts and whatnot. Well, not even the Vanderbilts necessarily. They were the money millionaires. But, you know, the Astors and the Cabots and the Lodges. But around the 1920s came cafe society, which was posited not so much on old money or even new money as much as fame. And that lasted from 1920 to about 1950. And then concurrent with the rise of television came the notion of celebrity. People who were famous basically for being famous. Now, comedy, as I've stated many times, is as old as Greek drama. Because, as a matter of fact, it precedes Greek drama to a certain degree. Greek drama didn't start out as Greek drama. It started out as a person who basically got up on stage and did an incantation. And then the Greeks had the idea, hey, let's bring some other guy out here, and then we'll have a dialogue. And then from dialogue came drama. So stand-up comedy has an old and very distinguished lineage, and the places in which it is performed, though they may constantly change, are in fact merely changing cultural manifestations of the same space. It's basically an open space where a person in agora, where an individual can express his or herself to a crowd who is circled round. Of course, some rooms are better than others. Somehow basement rooms seem to have more of a cachet among comedians. You never see comedy performed in a penthouse or outdoors, or at least if you do, then it's not a commonplace sort of thing. Generally, comedy is a first floor or basement type of thing. Generally, the room is reasonably small. If you're familiar with the old nightclub Stitches, that's basically a pretty commonplace type of comedy room. Well, anyway, some more thoughts on the form of humor as related to literature. The Latin proverb, ars est citare artem, art lies in the concealment of art, can be traced all the way back to what Heraclitus said about hidden harmonies are the best harmonies. And this pertains to comedy insofar as this whole notion of comedy consisting basically in the unexpected, a meshing, a coming together of two disparate threads in a way in which it is seamless. You don't see the seam underneath, you only see the meshing of the two disparate threads. Now, Florney Miller has said that the simplicities of life translated into terms of the human frailties make for the best humor. And he's not far wrong with that. Basically what he's saying is everyday things translated into a certain character, and generally a character which is not by any means infallible, that tends to be what people consider funny. Why? Because it's something that everybody can relate to. Now, the problem is, the rat-a-tat-tat stand-up comedian thing is becoming rather cliche. As Phoebe Pettengill has put it, overexposure can render things, everything, good, bad, or mediocre, into stereotypes to our jaded sensibilities. So if you get up there and you think because you have a good line of patter and you can do it bam, 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 that you're necessarily going to get over on any crowd at all, then you're very sadly mistaken. It's very difficult to predict how a crowd is going to react to your stage persona, and that's what makes comedy, perhaps in many ways, the ultimate challenge. Because basically, a comedian is an introvert in an extrovert's profession, as has been said of Richard Nixon in politics. You have to be a writer, and yet a writer who is willing to put his or herself on the line, and a writer who is willing not to be content to simply set things down on the page and let the market decide whether it's good or not, or whether it's viable or not, but a writer who is willing to test their material to see if people react to it in the positive way which comedians depend upon. That is to say, they laugh. Now, Stephen Camphor has said that the standard forms of European vaudeville were intimidation and embarrassment. And that gets us all the way back to the Greek insult contests and the British flighting and the dozens and Don Rickles and all that stuff. David Bromwich has said, people who laugh at wretches and anecdote are apt to share the fun when the wretches of actual life are set upon. There is a certain sadistic element to humor. Some people will laugh at sadistic material. However, the good comedian does not depend upon the more bloodthirsty members of his audience to carry the rest of them along in gales of merriment which are focused upon the misfortunes of some outside individual. A good comedian can turn an audience's natural sympathy to his advantage while at the same time producing a humorous effect by, making that poor schmo his or herself. Now, Stephen Camphor also says, laughing matters. Without it, we are victims of circumstance and fate. With it, we can get through the worst of times and fashion the best of times. So, humor is not all sadistic laughing at the misfortunes of others. Humor has an element of hope in it, too. That no matter how bad things can get, as long as you're able to laugh at them and perhaps at yourself, then you can find relief from any sort of torment that you might, in fact, undergo due to the vicissitudes of life, culture, plot, or your own character or personality. Well, now this properly belongs in the chapter on note-taking, how to write humor, but I'll state it here anyway. Originality and a feeling of one's own dignity are achieved only through work and struggle. Now, Dostoevsky said that. It's predictable. But that's the sort of thing that Dostoevsky was known for saying. Now, Victoria Abril once said, movies are lies to tell the truth. Now, I think the same is true of many forms of comedy. Because, this sort of contradicts what was said earlier about how nothing is funnier than the truth. But you can't just state the truth in the boldest of terms and expect to get a laugh, unless it's something that's just so original that people just are delighted. They have this laugh of recognition and also of wonderment that they haven't thought of it before. Getting back to what Elizabeth Bishop said about mystery being one of the components of a successful poem, and to my way of thinking, a successful comedic monologue as well. Movies, and for that matter, comedic material, comedy is a lie to tell the truth. In other words, you say, oh, I had such a terrible time. A funny thing happened to me on the way over here. Well, it may not have happened to you, but the fact that it didn't happen to you makes it no less funny if, in fact, you happen to come up with a good line to follow that up. Like, for example, a funny thing happened to me on the way over here. I went from 0 to 60 in 9 seconds. And now I'm 99 years old. See, it's a lie to tell the truth. The truth of art consists in its power to break the monopoly that those in power exercise by defining what's real. Now, predictably enough, this was in The Nation. But it's very apropos. The truth of art consists in its power to break the monotony that those in power exercise by defining what's real. Comedy constitutes its own separate reality. Now, how do we get to comedy? The best comedy mixes compassion and observation. How do we get to comedy? Knowledge. Knowledge creates a premise. There is no imagination without knowledge. Now, Wendy Lesser says, forming your own opinions in the face of whatever crazy things the grown-ups say is the most exciting rebellion of all. And that's basically one aspect of comedy that I'll discuss, is the aspect of rebellion, of tearing away the veil of lies behind the things of the mediocre everyday and showing them for what they really are. As the Sex Pistols said, we mean it, man. And that's what comedy is. We mean it, man. I mean, that's what drives comedy. Comedy itself would be pretty boring if it were nothing more than a catalog of your grievances. Really good humor, says Charles Peters, really good humor requires that the humorist be able to laugh at himself. And you can't laugh at yourself unless you're willing to acknowledge your own shortcomings. Now, by acknowledging your own shortcomings, to a certain degree you're also acknowledging that there are shortcomings in the society as a whole, not necessarily to place blame on the overall society as an excuse, but because you're able to acknowledge your own shortcomings, it makes it easier for the audience to accept that perhaps there are certain aspects of the society in which they live, are a part of, and help create, that also have their shortcomings. Now, lest you think that comedy is essentially frivolous and inconsequential, no less an authority than Ludwig Wittgenstein has said, a serious work in philosophy could be written that consisted entirely of jokes. And believe me, I've been working on this for quite some time. Yes, well, C.N. Hetzner has said, writing is like starting a business. Manuscripts are a product and inventory. And nowhere is this more true than in writing comedy. Your product and inventory are your jokes. It's what you come up with. It's your ideas. And believe me, anybody who can write more than 30 jokes in 1 week, I take my hat off to them. Of course, the reason I wear this hat is so you won't see how filthy my hair is. Well, unfortunately, endeavors that delight you enlighten the brain. Unpleasant tasks can dull it. And coming up with 30 jokes on the night before your first monologue is definitely an unpleasant task. Better to pace yourself through the week, come up with those 30 jokes 2 or 3 at a time, if you can, rather than try to write them all in one night, as I have done on more than one occasion. Anytime it involves money or sex, there is great comedy there, says Jay Leno. Well, yeah, because those are things that people can relate to. They are part of everyday experience. You don't change anybody's mind with comedy, you just reinforce what they already believe. Once again, that's Jay Leno. Well, you may not change their mind, but I think you can, rather than merely reinforce what they already believe, help shift, create a paradigm shift. Make people see that there isn't just black and white, that there are shades of gray that can be slowly moved one way or the next in order to adapt to changing circumstances. Well, basically humor is truth. Humor is the unexpected, and the truth is always unexpected and frequently unwelcome. You know, the meaning of daily life always eludes us, says Pat Aufderheide, because we're too busy living the story to retell it. It takes an artist to make somebody else's daily life more meaningful to us. We're too busy living the life to tell it, at least to tell it in a form which is bound to have permanence, to be of lasting value. That's basically what the comedian does. He's like the barroom philosopher who translates something which is of interest only to that person's friends into something which is of greater interest to a larger audience of people who don't necessarily know who he or she is. Now, Gary Larson, who was the comic strip writer of The Far Side, has said that the key element in any attempt of humor is conflict. Our brain is suddenly jolted into trying to accept something that is unacceptable. The punchline of a joke is the part that conflicts with the first part, thereby surprising us and throwing our own synapses into some kind of fire drill. And this is very true. Comedy is the unexpected, and comedy thrives on conflict. Conflict which, on the other hand, although it tears apart, it also meshes. It enables us to see something as a whole because in its very opposition, it meshes. You see what I'm getting at here? Willie Cipher says, the ambivalence of comedy reappears in its social meaning, for comedy is both hatred and revel, rebellion and defense, attack and escape. It is revolutionary and conservative. Socially, it is both sympathy and persecution. You know, I couldn't have done this better if I had already read this thing before even starting to do this thing. It's all falling into place here. Comedy is hatred and revel, rebellion and defense, attack and escape, revolutionary and conservative. And if you doubt this, remember, most satirists are profoundly conservative. Well, I look at Rush Limbaugh, for example, which is to say, they create satire, which we'll be getting into more in the 9th week, unless I decide to extend this to 20 weeks, because I have enough material to do like 20 shows instead of 10 as I originally thought. I'm going to stick to this original plan, though, until a better one appears. It is revolutionary and conservative, comedy is. Socially, it is both sympathy and persecution. It's all coming into place. This is what I'm getting at. Comedy is not just insult contests. It is also that brave fool, clown, court jester, silent film comedian a la Keaton or Harold Lloyd or Charlie Chaplin, the lone guy who stands up against the figures of authority versus the guy who, is full of malice like W.C. Fields and who, or Don Rickles who creates conflict. These are disparate strains which come together. The passion of laughter, says Thomas Hobbes, is nothing else but sudden glory arising from sudden conception in some eminency in ourselves by comparison with the infirmity in others. Now, this is, of course, the theory that like comedy is basically sadistic. It is, but it's sort of like the sadist versus the world, and it's not totally sadistic, nor is it totally me versus the world. There are elements of both in comedy. Al Capp, the famous comic strip artist of yore, has said, all comedy is based on man's delight in man's inhumanity to other men. Now, Sigmund Freud more or less expounds on this very theme by stating that to adopt a humorous attitude towards others is to assume the attitude of an adult towards a child, recognizing and smiling at the triviality of the interests and sufferings which seem to the child so big. He argued that we often laugh because of our awareness of the disparity between a perceived action, such as that of a clown and a bungling comedian, and what we know is possible from us. So yes, there is a certain amount of condescension to our ability to laugh, but believe me, this condescension is this creating of this sort of comfortable feeling in the auditor that the comedian is somebody who's not as good as he is. It's something that's very carefully crafted and created by the comedian himself. The comedian is not just some hapless, bumbling victim, because again, that would awaken a sense of discomforting sympathy which makes people feel a little queasy and makes them squirm. And you don't want to do that. Basically, you're pretending to be a schmuck or a schlemiel, but by virtue of the fact that they're all listening to you, you're not really. You're like the court jester who has the license to say things which are forbidden to ordinary people. There's a certain shamanic aspect to the work of certain comic practitioners. For example, my old pal Lenny Bruce. Now, Charles Schulz, the comic strip writer, has said, "The pleasure of such humor is in the feeling of release from the tensions of repressing the..." I don't think Charles Schulz said this. This is probably Charles E. Schulz, someone else. "The pleasure of such humor is in the feeling of release from the tensions of repressing the impulse to be aggressive." In other words, the comedian is the guy who is the designated aggressive one. Repressing the impulse to be aggressive, and also in the sense of superiority at the successful exercise of a prohibited aggression. The comedian is the guy who gets up there and says the aggressive things that you only think and don't necessarily ever express to others. Now, Freud argued that people appear comic to us in comparison to ourselves when they make too great an expenditure on bodily functions and too little on mental ones. Who among us has not laughed at the high school football jock who thinks that football is the be-all and end-all of his existence? I had a roommate in high school who thought that wrestling was the be-all and end-all of why he was put here on earth. And I felt sorry for him. I didn't necessarily think he was humorous, although there was a certain degree of humorousness in his way of thinking. Now, Ebert Williams says, "All the jokes in the world are based on a few elemental ideas, and this is one of them. The sight of other people in trouble is nearly always funny." And for an example of that, you need turn to no less a source than virtually any film that Buster Keaton has ever made, virtually all of which end with him being chased by cattle, or women, or fleeing boulders, or fleeing policemen. The sight of other people in trouble is nearly always funny. So when the stand-up comedian gets up there and ruefully confesses that he made an enormous blunder, and this is how it turned out, then that is funny. And yet, the fact that he gets up there and says it, he's like the center of attention. That empowers him in a degree which changes the attitude of the audience from mere sympathy to empathy, and not even necessarily to empathy, but to admiration. Well, he may be a schmuck, but he's able to get up there and admit it, and he makes us laugh, and he's funny, so maybe he's not such a schmuck after all. And that's basically a motive of comedians, to take an early wound or a recent wound and translate it into comedic material, which helps him to overcome it. Now, much humor by its very nature, says Bergson in his treatise on laughter, much humor by its very nature forces us to drop the mask we have composed, and it strips man of his breeches. Now, it has been said of the essayist Dwight MacDonald that his eternal obsession was to locate the exact point where the seemingly true turned out to be patently false. And that, again, is where comedians get a good deal of their impetus. To turn the seemingly true, to take the patently false and strip the varnish away to reveal that which is patently true. Now, diseased language, ritualized thinking, aversion to criticism, versus true language, new thinking, sharp criticism. See, this is the central dialectic of what is comic, what is the topic of comedy, what is the rationale behind comedy, and what is not. Comedy attacks pompous bureaucrats. Comedy attacks people who are so locked into a mode of thinking that they can't ever really imagine any other world other than their own. Comedy deflates the pomposity of people who cannot bear to be criticized. And it does this by taking the exact opposite. It uses true language. It comes up with new ways of thinking of things, and it utilizes sharp criticism in order to attain these goals. Barbara Emile has said, "What makes people laugh at jokes is the honesty in them." And of course, we all know that children tend to be honest. Look at the fable of the Emperor's New Clothes. Out of the mouths of babes and sucklings. And of course, Baudelaire has said, "Genius is childhood recalled at will." And comedy is basically, among other things, the comic turns himself into a child and reacts to things the way a knowing child with a large vocabulary would react to them. Not necessarily as a smug, precocious child, but although sometimes that is also the case, but as a child who can't really conceive of deception as being a viable strategy. A child who doesn't really know anything other than what is real, and so finds it difficult to be deceptive. Well, I'm going to take a break here. I have to renew my notes somewhat, and when I come back, we will conclude this presentation of Mirth. I am the wrong hero. Well, I'm back in the saddle again. Well, as long as we're winding this down, I'd like to, there's some very important things that I would like to get into this presentation, and so I'm going to keep my commentary to a minimum and leave them off to you. Freud has said it will not surprise us to find that the naive in humor occurs for the most part in children, and that it is then carried over to uneducated adults whom we may regard as childish. But there is the possibility of misleading naivete. We may assume in the child an ignorance that no longer exists, and children represent themselves as naive so as to enjoy a liberty they would not otherwise be granted. And that, that gets us right back to the comic Jester, and the comedian as somebody who tells the truth, but in his art is such that he presents it in a way that doesn't create turmoil, but laughter. In other words, the comedian doesn't get up on stage and say, "You are all fools, you will be destroyed," not unless, of course, he is the wrong hero. Now, the comic gets up there and says, this thing happened to me, it was crazy, I'm telling you, it's really something. Haven't you ever had something like that? Of course you've had that happen to you. Oh, yes, you have. Humor, says Langston Hughes, and this really hits the target. Humor is laughing at what you haven't got when you ought to have it. Of course, you laugh by proxy. You're really laughing at the other guy's lacks, not your own. That's what makes it funny. The fact that you don't know you are laughing at yourself. Humor is when the joke is on you but hits the other fellow first, because it boomerangs. Humor is what you wish in your secret heart were not funny, but it is, and you must laugh. Humor is your unconscious therapy. Therapy, you see? It's that childhood wound. Why do people do comedy? It's because something happened to them. Either they found out they weren't the center of the world, or it was something far worse than that, but they have to recover themselves somehow. And one way in which the human animal is built to recover something which has been lost is through laughter. Now, although the ability to observe oneself with some degree of detachment is most often a prerequisite for humor, the comic impulse rarely coexists with hesitancy, passivity, and self-consciousness. It is an art of the bravado personality. Even when it arises out of an underlying sense of insecurity, it issues most effectively from an assumed position of eminence and self-assurance, based on some real or imagined trait such as physical prowess, social status, or intellectual or moral superiority. Whether stoked by irreverence or self-righteousness, as with satirists such as H.L. Mencken and Jonathan Swift, or nourished by worldliness or the underdog's eye for contradiction or pretension, as with, say, George Bernard Shaw and Will Rogers, humor reflects an aggressive thrust or ascendancy. It may assume the guise of modesty and self-effacement, as with comics such as Stephen Wright or Woody Allen, but even then, at minimum, it still extols and celebrates the perspicuity of that viewpoint. Humor is seldom neutral. Someone or something is nearly always the object of ridicule, the butt of the joke. Now, while humor may be the ultimate civilizer and perfect antidote for hubris, wrongheadedness, and pretension, it is also an outlet for sublimated aggression. Now, the critic C.P. Snow has said, "Those who know are inarticulate, and those who are articulate, don't know." And it's so often the case that the people who are willing to speak out are not necessarily the people who have the worldly experience to do so. And by the time you get that worldly experience, you are all the less so inclined to speak out. And the comedian short circuits this process. He is worldly, and yet he is not unwilling to speak out and say what, at least in his mind, needs to be said, expressed, and that is one of the bases of his aggression. Now, humor is founded on contradiction, and by its very nature it represents an upsurge of unconscious, often repressed motives and desires. Humor distorts the rational, evades most logical decoding, and is often amusing because it is what it is not. In other words, it seems to make sense. It almost makes sense. There is an element of sense to it, and yet, basically, the sense that it seems to be making simply isn't there. Now, humor makes us tend to identify with the one being laughed at, despite ourselves. It's a humanizing factor. In other words, I've been saying all along, the comedian is not somebody you feel sorry for. He's somebody you laugh at because he has the power to make you see what is humorous about the situation that a downtrodden person may be put into. But that does not mean that the audience is totally lacking in sympathy with the comedian. They're not sympathetic. They don't feel sorry for him, nor are they totally stony, cold-hearted against him either. There is a certain degree of sympathy working with this. That's why so many comedians work so hard to make themselves liked before they even tell their first joke. They want to get the audience on their side so they can say these things which on the one hand are condescending to them, and yet on the other hand are a means of expressing their aggression towards the world, which has made them the butt of its humor. Now, Kenneth Burke talks about the comic frame, and that's what every comedian has. When they look at something, they look at it through a frame, and it's a comic frame. A comic frame which, in the words of Kenneth Burke, allows man to transcend occasions when he has been tricked or cheated. And that's basically what I want to really stress in the closing minutes of this presentation. Transcendence, that's what comedy is about. Transcendence. And as O'Mealy puts it, the comic perspective permits one to be optimistically poised to respond effectively, to nurture his own life, taking all things, however absurdly baffling, as they come. Transcendence. No matter what happens to you, you can transcend it, and you can find a certain degree of equanimity in your life because you have the ability to laugh at it, and more importantly, to express yourself in a way which makes other people see the appropriateness of a humorous response to these disasters which befall you in the course of living your life. That's why most comedians are half crazy, you know. I mean, they always crummy stuff happening to them, and they can't wallow in it. They have to translate it into art, and sometimes repressing all of that lousy stuff makes them either into drug addicts or into really unpleasant individuals as persons, as opposed to their stage persona. Quite simply, humor is notoriously relative. And that's what makes it difficult to be a humorist. Again, we're getting into this cultural thing. Different cultures, says Stephen Dunstan, different ages of man and different states of inebriation can all render the best joke flat or the most banal comment hilarious. Humor is relative. Different cultures, which means what do I know that you don't know? What do you know that I don't know? What do we all know in common? Different ages of man. A 40-year-old's not going to laugh at jokes about, necessarily anyway, not going to laugh about jokes about getting drunk at the frat party and passing out and throwing up on the nitrous oxide tank. And the 20-year-old is not necessarily going to laugh about how they told the boss that, well, maybe you're a little drunk, boss, but actually you look like a pretty big drunk to me. See, humor is even age-specific, to say nothing of culturally specific, and you just don't know when you walk into that room what kind of culture the people that you're talking to come from. And the hell of it is, it's not even necessarily as though they're all firemen or policemen, but they're all from different cultures, they're all different ages, although I find that the comedy demographic tends to be in the 22 to 35 range, just as a useful information for all you aspiring humorists out there. Now, about political correctness, something that Todd Haynes said in the magazine Film Threat number 20 has always been something of a watchword for me. Humor is a tool, an incredible political tool, and just to simply say that is not allowed, I find to be the worst side of feminism or any other kind of political critique of our culture, when it takes on the same dogma as the culture imposes. So, you see, by being politically correct, you're not necessarily being good and saying, oh, I'm not going to laugh at that because that's cruel to, say, American Indians. What you're saying is, I'm going to adopt the same responses that Blue Noses and Puritans adopt to material they find inoffensive and inappropriate, but I'm going to turn it in such a way that makes me look good instead of merely puritanical and a blue nose. Now, one point that Marshall McLuhan made, according to Alan Fotheringham, is that artists, whether they be writers, painters, whatever, humorists, artists are the distant early warning line of the future. Artists are always ahead of their times, if only we would listen to them. The fools, if only they would listen to me. But they don't. Those scoundrels at the university, they laughed at my theories. And now, they'll be sorry. They'll all be sorry. They'll see. They'll all see. Someday they'll be sorry. Sorry they laughed at me. Sorry, I've been reading Spider-Man lately. It's like February 7th, and the storyline is mad scientist is angry at another guy because, anyway, look it up. You'll see. The fascination with the inevitable conflict between the individual as individual and the individual as part of a larger social unit. You know, it's like, hey, you know, I'm Joe Individual. I'm going to do what I want. Oh, I just got knocked on my ass by the forces that be. Oh, you know, but I'm still going to be an individual regardless. You know, I'm just stubborn and stupid like that. And that's where humor comes from. Children analyze fantasy, according to Dr. Seuss. Rest in peace. Children analyze fantasy. They know you're kidding them. There's got to be logic in the way you kid them. Their fun is pretending, making believe they believe it. And the same thing is true of a stand-up monologue. People know you're kidding, and yet they want to believe at some level that what you're saying is based in some type of experience, whether it be abstract experience or real-life experience. Now, John Franzen really says something that is almost perfectly apropos to end this piece, even though we're not quite through yet, but we will be in a couple minutes. Before a myth can matter, it has to entertain. Before a myth can matter, it has to entertain. That is basically the watchword. You're weaving myths up there, and yet they have to be entertaining myths. Sean French has said, the artist can turn anything at all into art, and the comedian can turn anything at all into comic material. The assassination of Lincoln? No problem. Who killed President Kennedy? I did it, but I was only 6 years old at the time. Oswald had to help me aim. Well, that's still too fresh in the mind, but you see what I'm getting at here. Anything. The artist can turn anything into art. The comedian can take any experience, any thought, any idea, and turn it into comedy. That's what comedy is. No holds are barred. But you know, Americans, according to Michael Carlson, have always been keener on myth than reality. Now, comedy is about spontaneous image making. And spontaneous image making, according to Andrew Delbanco, is the mark of a living language. A shared language is the only conduit we have into the interior life of other people. So comic syntax, comic shorthand, the way a comic will start a phrase and then he knows that you know that what he's saying has been digested, and he ends it in the middle, like, and so comic syntax, the spontaneous image making of the comedian, that is the shared language that a comedian utilizes in order to express himself to people. He doesn't confine himself to any one specific subject or purpose. He just says what he has to say in his own style, and in that way, hopefully, he's able to express himself. Eugene Weber has said something which might very well be perhaps an appropriate way to end this presentation for this week. Creation, affirmation are what matter if you want to make a name for yourself and make it last. Otto Friedrich has said that we are all engaged in the same enterprise. We are all seeking evocations or representations of what we can recognize as appropriately human. We are all caught up in the telling of stories. Otto Friedrich has said that history, journalism, and autobiography are all part of the same process of storytelling, of revelation and self-revelation, of bearing witness. It is the process of the ancient mariner clutching at the wedding guest and insisting on his story. And Otto Friedrich has also said, the truth isn't about the acquisition of doctrine or the assimilation of statistics. It's about the courage to trust one's own thought and observation, to possess one's own history, speak in one's own voice. Stories may move from truth to facts, not the other way around, but the attempt to convey the essence of a thing, in that attempt, the teller of tales must give it a name, an age, and an address. And that's what the stand-up comedian does. As Robert Henri put it, low art is just telling things as there is the night. High art gives the feel of night. The latter is nearer reality, although the former is a copy. And that's what comedy does as well. It gives the feel of a situation. It doesn't merely describe it in flat, highly descriptive police blotter prose. It makes you feel what's going on. Tune in next week as The Wrong Hero discusses tradition on Cafe Cabaret.